Okay, we are in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33. And what I want to talk about this morning is how to have an incredible marriage, or the power of submission, part 2. Okay? And that second part may be like, what? Okay, this seems like what is wrong with marriage is not what's right. Now listen, anytime you read the Bible in any depth, you are going to encounter hard passages. And when you do, you actually have two basic options. One, you can recoil. You can be like, ugh, awful, terrible, indignation. And listen, you'll probably find people that will agree with you on whatever it is you're recoiling against. But if you do that, if that's your response, it's primarily recoiling, one of the dangers is that you will end up stunted. Do you know why? Because you've never actually wrestled with the passages and thought about it. There will just be areas that are no-fly zones for you. Okay? Now listen, the other option to recoiling is to be curious, to be like, ooh, this is interesting. There's a puzzle here. What is going on? Why might he say this? Now listen, if you do this, much of what you're going to wrestle with may actually make you very uncomfortable. But I think it's going to expand you as a person so that even if you don't end up agreeing, you will at least have thought about it much more deeply. Okay? And I think in general, when we as human beings think about things, that's a good thing. We're meant to be thoughtful. Okay. This is a hard passage. Make no mistake. Look at verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Ugh. Okay? Verse 23.
You're not a wife.
A husband, yeah. Believe me, I've known plenty that are like, I'm taking it from expert evidence, okay? A husband is the head of the wife. Holy cow. Verse 24, as the church submits to Christ, wives should submit to everything, in everything, to their husbands. And you just go, my goodness. Now listen, before we recoil, isn't it curious what he says right after this to men? Okay? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. He's not talking about passion between the sheets there. He is actually talking about leadership for men. And you go, oh, well, how? He says, love your wives the way Christ loved the church, who gave himself up for her. In other words, what did Christ do? He entered this world. He became a human. He walked in our shoes. He suffered. He learned obedience through hardship. Okay? He went to the cross. He died. He sacrificed himself. Okay? The point is, what Paul is saying to men here is, you've got to die. You've got to learn to lay down your lives. And here's the part that's really, really curious and interesting to me. As a man, there may be 3 verses for women, but there are 9 verses to dudes. Okay? Paul is saying, this is the amazing thing, you actually need both of these, submission and leadership, in order to have an incredible marriage. Now, pause right there. Do you see what curiosity does? It immediately reframes the question, and you haven't necessarily figured anything out, but you've noticed something that's going to get you in and make you wrestle with it. This passage is not actually about one thing, wives submit, it's actually about 2 things. Wives, learn how to submit. Men, learn how to sacrifice and die. Be a leader. Okay? The point is, the passage is about both of those things working together, like 2 sides of a coin. Okay, now last week, Laura asked the question, and she said, what does this kind of behavior that it's talking about in this passage actually look like? That is a really good question, and I want you to keep that in the back of your head today because that's what we want to talk about. In other words, how does it practically apply? Before we do that, though, what I want to give you, here's the outline for today. First of all, 4 anchors that you can hold on to as you think about this thing. Second, 2 examples of how this might play out, and I think that's going to get to the behavior. Third, there is one thing you never want to forget. 4 anchors, 2 examples, one thing you never want to forget. Okay, and before we jump into that, I gave you a working definition last week of both submission and leadership, and I just want to repeat it because I think it's really important and it'll be helpful. Okay, last week I said, here's a working definition of submission. Do you remember what it was? Serve, support, follow, and sometimes yield. Serve, support, follow, sometimes yield. Now, do you remember what I said the working definition of leadership was? To serve, to support, to spur onwards, and oftentimes to sacrifice and die. Let me repeat that. Submit means serve, support, follow, and sometimes yield. Lead means serve, support, spur on, and oftentimes sacrifice and die. Both of those things have a lot of overlap, but they go in slightly different directions. And when you put those 2 things together, it actually makes an incredible team. So we'll come back to that. I want you to think about it. Let's jump in and start with the 4 anchors, 4 insights that I think you really want to hold on to. So here's the first insight as we look at this passage. There are 3 different domains. We talked about this last week. There's the domain of marriage, there's the domain of family, there is the domain of work. Okay? And in each of these domains, there are similarities. All require submission, all require leadership. We talked about this last week. But there are differences as well. In other words, what submission and leadership look like within each of these contexts might actually be different. So it's really, really important to be like, oh, I need to pay attention to these domains and know what's similar and what's different. Now, let me give you an example of this where it first started to make sense for me. So I'm a pastor. I also run a brewery. Okay. And I meet people all the time who are like, wait, you're a pastor that runs a brewery? And they're like, what kind of pastor is this? Or what kind of brewery is this? And I'm like, hey, okay, listen, let me explain. First of all, I say, this is not a brewery trying to start a church. And then I say, but it's also not a church trying to start a brewery. I am dumb enough to do 2 things at once. Okay? I tend to think it's a really bad idea when you try to run a business like a church or a church like a business. In other words, let me put it this way. Who was late today? Somebody was late. We don't fire you for being late to church. But if somebody's late to work, it might actually be appropriate to fire. Do you see what I'm saying? Different domains. There's some similarity, but there's some differences. And if you don't know what domain you're operating in, okay, you actually won't operate well in that domain. But guess what I do with both the brewery and the church? Do you know what I spend most of my time doing? Leadership development. In other words, what I do in the workplace informs how I do leadership development in the church. And what I do in the church informs how I do leadership development at work. In other words, there's some similarities that inform one another, but there's differences that also inform one another. This is why it's so important to understand your domains. And you've got 3 domains here, and I just want to point out some similarities and differences between each of them. First of all, marriage. How long is marriage supposed to be? Lifelong. It's a lifelong commitment, theoretically, between a man and a woman. Now, think about this. when you have somebody get into this lifelong relationship between a man and a woman, okay, they tend to be similar age, similar maturity, similar values. The Bible uses language of don't be unequally yoked, right? Okay. Now listen, in a marriage, I hate spam phone calls. Do you want to see where I am least like Jesus?
It's not road rage.
I am like, man.
Cold callers serve a purpose too.
I know. I have to hand my phone to Carrie sometimes. So I'm like, either that, or I'm like, I start cussing at my phone. Anyway, it's like, I'm in church right now trying to tell people about Jesus. What do you think you're doing? Okay, I don't sound very much like Jesus, do I? Anyway, all right. In marriage, lifelong commitment should be similar age, maturity, and values. But think about this. You're actually supposed to play favorites in marriage. You are supposed to be exclusive to this one person. You're going to love them like you love nobody. They're your one true love. Okay? In a marriage, you have lots of choice on the front end. Okay? You have the option to not get married. You can pick who you want to marry. Okay? But you have very little choice afterwards. You're supposed to do the till death do we part thing. Okay, that's marriage. Now think about family, specifically raising kids. Listen, is it lifelong? No! 20 years. Then you should be out of the house. Maybe 22, 24. But the point is, if you had kids that are like, hey, this is great. I have a lifelong relationship with you and you're just going to pay my bills. You would be like, you do not understand this family thing. It's actually meant to be short term. Think about the age maturity values. Parents versus kids. There's a massive difference. Parents are supposed to have learned a few things because kids are feral animals. And you're trying to help them become responsible adults. Okay, so there's a massive difference. Now listen, favoritism. Okay, in a marriage, you should play favorites with your spouse, your partner. But in a family, if you play favorites with kids, you will destroy them. You will destroy that family. Do you see what I'm saying? Different domains. Kids, did they have any choice about the families they were born into? No, they didn't. Okay? Sometimes the parents didn't have that much choice either. But the point is, little choice on the front end, but lots of choice on the back end. Once you're out of the house, you can do whatever you want to do. You can be different than your parents. You can be like your parents. My point is, do you see how those two domains are different? Okay, let me give you another one. Work. You could argue that both family and marriage are covenantal. Guess what? Work is transactional. And that's not a bad thing in the workplace. In other words, you're like, hey, Georgie, I would like to hire you to do a job. I'm going to pay you money, and you are going to do work. And if you do the work, I give you the money. And if we're happy, and if you don't do the work, I fire you. Okay? It's very transactional. But that's appropriate to the workplace. Imagine if I said, hey, Georgie, welcome to All Souls. I'm going to pay you money to show up. And as long as you show up, everything... No, that's not how the kingdom works. Okay. Work is generally not permanent. You can quit. The boss can fire you. Work is generally involving choice on both sides, both on the front and on the back. Listen, now here's the point of this. Why am I pointing out these differences? It would be a grave mistake to treat a marriage partner like a child or a slave or a master. See that? Because they're different domains. It would be a grave mistake to seek emotional fulfillment as a husband or wife from a child or from your work. Okay? But you should seek emotional fulfillment, not ultimate, but emotional fulfillment from your spouse. Okay? It would be a grave mistake to think you've got to stick with a job like you need to stick with a marriage, or to approach marriage like you approach a job. All right? Here's the point. All of these domains involve submission and leadership, but what submission and leadership looks like is different in both. They're similar, but they're different, and they inform one another. But in order to understand how they inform one another, you've got to understand where are they the same and where are they different. Okay, now, why is this important? I'm going to show you in just a second. But the first thing I want you to see is these three domains actually help you have context. So when we talk about a marriage relationship, you might learn something about that from what it looks like to submit or to lead in the other two domains. All right? Here's the second thing. So first thing, just think this. Context is king. We got multiple domains. Context is king. Second thing. Did you guys catch the passage about headship? Look at verse 23. Husband is head of a wife, even as Christ is the head of a church. You need to control your child. No, I'm just kidding. We're not on that passage today. I won't say it. Listen. Verse 23. The husband is head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. When you hear headship language, I want you to think chain of command. It is very easy when you hear headship to have a very negative reaction because it sounds very oppressive, and applied wrongly, it will be. But understood rightly, it's actually a safety valve against oppression. And I want to show you how that works. Look at 1 Corinthians 11. Flip in your Bibles to the left just a little bit. It's not very far. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you get to Romans, you went too far. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Have you guys ever read this passage? It's about head coverings. It is a weird passage. Don't get stuck on the head coverings. Listen to this. Verse 3. I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, do you hear the same headship language? Okay. A couple of observations, and I can make the point very simply. First of all, it's a confusing passage because it's talking about head coverings, long hair. It's really strange. People get very hung up on this passage. I think what will be helpful is when you realize Paul is not trying to get men to cut their hair short and women to grow their hair long. They do that already. He's also not trying to get men to take their hats off when they pray and women to put hats on, head coverings. They do that already. In other words, he's not reasoning from headship to those behaviors. He's actually reasoning from those things that they already do, and he's trying to get them to understand they have a concept of headship already built into things they believe in. Now listen, he is working from things they already do or already believe, and he's saying, first of all, guys, there are differences between men and women at the very least in a marriage. Second, he is saying there seems to be some hierarchy to leadership. He uses that headship language. Now listen, follow me on this. Who's the head of the wife according to this passage? Husband. Okay. Who's the head of the husband according to this passage?
Jesus.
Jesus. Who's the head of Jesus according to this passage?
God.
Who doesn't have a head? Nobody. Other than God. Okay. But the point is, everyone has a head. See, oftentimes when we talk about headship, do you know what people think? They think, oh, man is the head of the wife. Who's the man's head? Man. That is not what the text is saying. The text is saying everybody has a head. Okay? And here's the second part of this. These aren't the only heads. After all, think if you were a male slave. Who is your head? Not just Jesus, also your master. That's what he says in Ephesians. Okay? What if you're the male master? Who's your head? It's not just Jesus. It's leaders of the church. Okay? Hebrews 13. Christians, obey your leaders. That's everybody. It is the government. Okay, Christians, submit to the government, submit to authorities. Romans chapter 13, 1 Peter chapter 2. The point is there are all sorts of heads, and everybody is actually under some head. Usually there's more than one. There is no such thing as an independent head. Everyone answers to someone. Imagine right now in our country if everybody actually believed that. Things would run a lot differently. But we have a bunch of people who think they don't answer to anybody. And Paul is saying, no, you do. And the sooner you realize it, the better. Everyone answers to someone. So when you see this headship language, what I hope you remember, when you see it in Ephesians, you should go, oh, that's actually a good thing because everybody has a head, including the husband, and everybody has more than one head. In other words, my husband's not the only head. All right, that's going to be really important. I'll show you that in just a second. So the first thing, there's 3 different domains. You need to know the context, similarities and difference. The second thing, headship, okay, is chain of command language. Third thing, the purpose of marriage. What is marriage for? We're back in Ephesians now, very briefly. We live in a culture that thinks primarily marriage is about what? Your happiness, your fulfillment. And the Bible actually says marriage is about God's purpose for us in this world. Okay? If you look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31, he says this. He says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What's he quoting there? Genesis chapter 2. Okay? Let's actually flip to Genesis chapter 2 real quick. Right at the very front of your Bibles. First, it's the first Bible in the Bible. Okay? Genesis chapter 2. This is before Adam and Eve have eaten the apple. Okay? This is pre-fall. All right? And one of the things, here's what I want you to see. Look at verse 15. It says, the Lord God took man, who's the man? Adam. And he put him in the garden to do what? To work it and keep it. In other words, man is supposed to be a gardener, not a miner. What do miners do? They just take stuff out and they tend to trash the earth. What does a gardener do? In other words, think about this. If you mine something, after you're done mining, what's left? It's all gone. All the good stuff's gone. If you're a gardener, the more a gardener works the garden, the better the garden gets. And God says, I've given you this planet as a garden, and I want you to tend it. I want you to cultivate it. I want you to make it even better. So that's the first thing. That's Adam's number one charge. It's not about his happiness. He's got a purpose for God's vision for this world. Hey, I've created this amazing world. You're going to garden and make it even better. Now look down at verse 18. Then the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Listen, everything up to this point, this is before the fall. Do you remember Genesis chapter 1? God does this, it was good. God does this, it was good. God does this, and this, and this. It was good, 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 very good. This is the very first thing that he says, not good. And it's not good, not because of sin, but because God has designed man to be incomplete on his own. He is actually meant to be part of something else. In other words, man is designed to be one of a 2-piece, really a 3-piece puzzle. Somebody else plus God. Relationship altogether. Okay. The point, though, is he looks at Adam and he says, it's not good for him to be alone. I'm going to design a helpmate. What does that tell you about the purpose of a wife. It's actually to help within the marriage, within the man's vision. So, mission. Listen, the way this plays out, Adam's got a mission, Eve's got a supporting role. That doesn't mean that one's better than the other. The passage doesn't spell out exactly what it looks like, but you can see the basic framework. And here's what I want, the reason why this is so important. When he quotes this, he's saying there's actually a purpose for your marriage. And do you know what most people in our culture think the purpose for their marriage is? Themselves, their own happiness. And he's saying, people, you need to recognize that, number one, there's multiple domains you can learn from. Number two, there's a chain of command. Number three, there is a mission and purpose in your marriage. Are you working on that together? Both the husband and the wife need to come back and go, oh, it's not just about me being happy. I'm actually here for a reason. If you don't believe that God has a purpose for your marriage, and I would call that shalom, you will supply a purpose for yourself, my happiness or my shalom. So just remember this: when it comes to marriage, God has a purpose for the partnership. Here's the fourth thing: it looks like a dance. Where in real life do you see two people submitting and yielding? Let me say it this way: submitting and leading. Two people doing this simultaneously. So you got one person serving, supporting, following, sometimes yielding, submitting. And then you've got another person serving, supporting, spurring, encouraging, exhorting, directing, leading. Okay? Without either person getting tromped on. Instead, they are so in sync that it actually looks like one person, a single unit. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. The two become one. And you go, okay, when that happens, it looks effortless. And there is a place that we see that happen besides marriage. Do you know what it is? Dancing. Okay? Now listen, I'm terrible at dance. All right? Imagine what would happen. Here's a thought experiment. If we got 100,000 people, put them all out on a gigantic ice rink, and said, everybody find a partner. One person's going to lead. One person's going to follow. Oh, by the way, strap on skates. Okay, guys, you're the leader. Women, okay, you're going to submit, follow, yield. Now, we're going to do this thing called a triple axel. And the guy's going to throw you in the air, and you're going to like gracefully pirouette and land. Okay, if we got 100,000 people, and we all tried to do that, what would it be?
50,000 deaths.
It'd be 50,000 deaths. There'd be chaos. Okay, but listen, no matter how much chaos you saw, because most people can't just naturally do that. It takes a huge amount of work, huge amount of training. It would be a huge mistake, even if you saw 99,998 failures, it'd be a huge mistake to assume that it couldn't happen. We see it all the time at the Olympics, where people do amazing things. You're like, how do they do that? You have these incredibly in sync dances, whether it's on skates or whether it's, on a floor. The point is, it's possible. So these are the four things that you can hang on to. Number one, there's different domains. You can learn from them. Number two, there's a chain of command. That's your friend. Number three, there is a purpose. That is really, really important. Number four, it is possible to have this kind of relationship. Anybody who dances will tell you somebody's got to lead. Somebody's got to follow. So I just want you to go, oh, it really is possible. And when you see it, it does not look oppressive. It looks beautiful and it looks effortless, even though it takes a tremendous amount of work, training, and preparation to learn how to do those things. Okay, so those are the four anchors. Let's do this real quick. Two examples about how this might play out. I want to go back to Laura's question, thinking about behavior. Imagine that you have a husband. You're looking at a husband who's mean, domineering, controlling. He's a bully. Does the wife have to submit to that? Now listen, I think a better question is, what might submission look like in that case? Here's what it's not. It's not blind obedience. Whatever he says, I'm going to have to do it. I'm just going to have to put up with it. But it's also not retaliation. It's not quid pro quo. It's not the cold shoulder. It's like, oh, if you're going to treat me like this, fine. I'm not, I'm going to be cold to you. Do you remember what the golden rule is? It's not do unto others as they do to you. It's do unto others as you wish that they would do to you. Okay? So if you try to build your marriage on absolute equity, absolute parity, if you live self-protectively to ensure your rights, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with this eye for an eye, quid pro quo, okay? And that's not what we're talking about here. I said this last week. You will be constantly keeping score. And nobody can live up to that. Okay. But what if it's this? Listen, what if you had a boss that was mean, domineering, controlling, and a bully? Anybody ever had a boss like that? What would you do? And now, some of you would be like, I'd quit, okay? And you could in a workplace environment. You got that right. However, any of you who have quit, you go to the next job, and guess what? There's probably going to be a boss there that's mean, domineering, controlling, bully. In other words, this actually happens. It can happen in every job. So let's say, and you might be like, hey, listen, I like my job apart from this. I don't want to quit. I don't want to have to move on. What would you do? And here's what you'd do. You'd talk to your boss and you'd say, hey, you're actually being really unkind, okay? This doesn't feel fair. This doesn't feel right. And if your boss didn't listen, do you know what you'd do? You'd go talk to your boss's boss, because your boss has a boss too. In other words, and that's not insurrection or insubordination. What is it? Working the chain of command. Okay, now listen. What are we doing here? We're working out of our domains, and it's like, oh, how would I handle something in this other domain? There's some similarities, there's some differences. They're not identical, okay? We're working out of headship, chain of command. We're going, hey, this isn't right. My boss has a boss too, and if my boss isn't going to listen to me, I am going to either go through lateral channels or I'm going to talk to my boss's boss. We're working out of our purpose. Okay, if we're going to be successful as a business, we're here to serve the customers, and that means we can't abuse our employees. All right? We're working into this passage. In this case, hey, husbands, you're supposed to love the wife. What does that look like? Let's talk about it. Okay? Because bullying is not loving. All right. Now listen. Do you see how that's a really practical example that's not just, oh, do I have to submit? It's like, no, what submission might actually look like is a wife going, hey, that doesn't feel right. I'm going to get some other people involved. Do you see that? Okay, let me give you a second example. What if you have a wife who has been hurt, traumatized, maybe she's afraid, maybe she struggles. I'm going to actually use Marilyn as an example. I'm going to give two examples. Okay, some of you know, here's the first example. Marilyn's dad is dying right now. Marilyn's dad, her entire life, I think she thinks, has been very bullying. He's been very proud, very religious, very judgmental, very condescending. And Marilyn hasn't been in contact with him for a long time. Now listen, it'd be really easy, and I've thought this, hey Marilyn, is there anything you want to say to him before he dies? She's like, nope. Okay. Now part of me, if I'm trying to lead Marilyn, you could maybe make a case that, hey, honey, I think it'd be good if you, so you don't have any regrets later. Now, listen, we've had this conversation, okay? You know what hit me the other day? Maybe the reason she doesn't want to do that is that's how traumatized she's been. And I'm like, you know what? I've asked her, and she says, nope, I'm good. I don't want to see him before he dies. Don't want to talk to him again. And me, you know what I've said? I'm like, you know what? I'm going to trust her on that. In other words, I've yielded to her on that one. Okay? Now let me give you a second example. When we came to Austin, remember that one? Marilyn didn't want to do that either, did you? She's like, I don't want to leave Montana. I don't want to leave my kids. I don't want to go try to start a brewery. I don't want to be a pastor's wife again. You know, like all of these things. I'm like, okay, now listen, that was a place where I was like, our list of allies grows thin. We don't have many options here. We can't really stay in Montana. We can't, you know, I feel called to try to do this. And I'm like, give me any other city that you could handle going to. She's like, I can't think of one. Give me, what do you want us to do? I don't know what I want us. But now again, I think Marilyn's, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Parents control your kids. No, it's good. Listen. But part of the reason Marilyn felt that way is she'd been hurt by church. She'd probably been hurt by me. It was a struggle. Okay? It involved risk. It involved going someplace she didn't know. And the point was, that was something where I had to, instead of yield, I had to say, we have to do something. And I really feel called. And here's an example where Marilyn yielded and followed. And as she's done that, I think you would say, Marilyn, your heart has actually opened. Like, I heard you say the other day how much you love this church and the people in it. And so what I'm getting at here is, what does this look like both to submit? Remember our definition. You're going to serve. You're going to support. Okay? You're going to follow. Sometimes you're going to have to yield. What does it mean to lead? Well, you're going to serve. You're going to support. You're going to spur on. Hebrews says, spur one another on towards love and good deeds constantly as we see the day approaching. Okay, and sometimes you're going to have to say, you know what, I think we got to do this. I think we've got to go this way. And Marilyn yielded, okay, and I tried to lead, but a lot of that leading involves sacrifice and death. And my point is that the way these things work out in all of these cases, again, we're working through our domains, we're working through this chain of command thing. We're working out our purpose. It's not to make the husband happy. It's not to make the wife happy. It's actually to say, why has God put us on this planet? And if you start to take God's purpose into your relationships, it will transform them. It will give. Part of the reason so many people have problems in their relationship is they are supplying their own purpose. Okay? And they don't have any sense of chain of command. They're like, it's my relationship. Okay? Now listen. Those are two examples. I'm not saying any of this is easy. Anything worth doing is usually very hard. I am saying I think that this thing Paul is talking about, submitting and leading, okay, the dance, I think it's possible. I think it's good. I think it takes a ton of time, and it's really, really difficult. But if you have two people that are both committed to this, something amazing can happen. Okay? Last thing. This is what I don't want you to forget, and I can say this very quickly. Who are we doing this stuff for? A lot of times, people look at this passage, wives submit, and it's the husbands saying it. And who are the husbands thinking about? Themselves. Or it's the wife saying, don't you tell me to submit. Okay? And who's she thinking about? Herself. But what you see in this passage, wives, submit to your husbands as to the what? Lord. In other words, who's the wife really supposed to be in love with? Jesus. That's her first love, her true love, her deepest love. If you love Jesus more than you love your husband, that will always be a good thing for your marriage. Men, it talks about husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word. He's giving men this example of Christ. Who does he want men to love the most? Not themselves, not their wives, Jesus. You take men who have been captivated by Jesus and they actually love Jesus more than they love themselves or their wives, you have the recipe for a great marriage. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it means it can be really good. The thing that you don't want to forget is we're not doing this stuff just to get a happy marriage, just to get blessed. We're actually doing it because we love Jesus, because he's the best. Okay? If Jesus is your main thing, you will be able to put up with all the failings of your partner. You'll actually be able to have hope for them changing. You will have hope for you changing. You will have a sense of purpose and chain of command that's bigger than your spouse. And that will allow your marriage to breathe and flourish. You'll be really intentional, but you also won't feel like you have to be controlling. You can be patient. All right? Don't forget that the main thing, the thing that prevents the abuse, is when people love Jesus more than anything else. That's why slaves, he can say to slaves, submit to your master as unto the Lord, but you don't ever have to call Caesar Lord. Okay? Even though I want you to submit to the government, but you don't have to do that. In other words, having your first love straight in your head will actually keep your marriage or your family or your work from owning you, which will protect you from abuse, and will also protect your spouse. Okay. What if you're not married? I'll just say this. You still have a head and you still have a purpose. Okay?